And just give us a second here, just waiting for the stream to go live. There is an issue on. There we go. Okay. So we should be live, and hello to everyone who's coming to the show today. And today we have Dr. Derman with us, who's the original OG. Dr. Derman's been with me for quite some time. And so I said he's the original OG here. One of the things today is Dr. Salem is actually, it's his birthday today. So if any of you guys want to go out to his social media account and wish him a happy birthday, I'm sure he would love to hear from you. So anyways, definitely wish him. I think he's younger than me, though. I was kind of hoping he was older than me, but he's not. I think he's pretty younger than me. But anyway, so this is an exciting show that we're going to be doing today. On the last episode, we talked about gender selection, and we were just, that show was really about talking about why do people do gender selection, and what the process is and the expectations. But we really didn't go into a lot of the things like, where did history come from? And there's a thing called sperm sorting, which is going to be a micro sorting. Dr. Derman's going to talk a little bit about this because he actually used to be in one of the centers. He's going to talk about it, did this. And so we want to kind of focus tonight on those things. And then we're going to also talk about the Zymot chip. A study came out recently on the Zymot chip, which is a chip that uses also sperm sorting, but in a different way, which is through fluid. Basically, think of it as the velocity of fluids and the mechanics of going through fluid, the sperm. And so we're going to talk about those two different things. But anyways, we're going to start things off about talking about sperm sorting. And I want to really give it off to Dr. Derman, because Dr. Derman, surprised to me, didn't know this, but he actually was at one of the main centers that did sperm sorting. And so I wanted to kind of hear your perspective, Dr. Derman. What was it like? I mean, when you guys were doing that, you mentioned something about the FDA there was a big part of them that was involved in not allowing it to become kind of mainstream at the time.
Well, I wouldn't say we were one of the main centers, but we were certainly we were one of the centers doing it. Originally, there was a technique that was widely used called the Erickson technique, and there were people, and I used to practice in New Jersey, so we had a huge demand for it in our area. And there was a group in New York that was doing it, and nobody really thought it worked very well. So they were coming up with other techniques. So there was a clinic in Washington, D.C. that came up with this microsort technique, where they put these little fluorescent tags on the sperm to figure out which ones are males and which ones are females, and they sorted them out. And so we were one of the centers. There were numerous centers around the country where, if we were going to do IVF or IUI, but usually it's for IVF, we would get this, they would collect the sperm, they would sort them out, and they would give us a sample that was enriched for boys or for girls. And they ran the study, and in the end, the FDA didn't approve it. The success rates for females were in the 80s, and in the males in the 70s. Compared to 50-50, they were pretty good, but the FDA didn't feel there was a quote-unquote need for it. And I think there were also some safety concerns about it as well. Although there weren't any problems, they didn't have a higher rate of birth defects. In fact, the babies had lower rates of birth defect. But in the end, the FDA didn't approve it. There were two centers doing it, one in Washington, and I think there was one somewhere in California. And the California study started a little later. So that continued for a couple more years after that, and then it just died out.
Yeah, I have a lot of people here that come to me today still, and they'll ask me about sperm sorting. And at least, again, I wasn't around that era when everyone was doing it, but I was around that time when people were, at least talking about it, oh, they used to do this. And I still hear, like in Mexico, they still do it. But the big thing is that it just wasn't very good. Meaning, like you said, it had that kind of 80%, but the things I would read would say it was even less than that. And I always made that argument.
Well, it was less than that for males, yeah.
Yeah.
For boys, it was less than that. And we got more requests for boys than for girls.
Yeah.
For girls, it was actually a little higher.
So when they did that, the way they were just testing it was they were just injecting sperm in, right? And then they were trying to find out, what gender they ended up having when they had a child. Is that how they were doing? Just following it up prospectively?
Well, yeah, they were. What they were doing is they were inseminating with the enriched ones, and then and some, you do IVF. But back then, when we were doing pre-implantation genetic screening, it wasn't very good.
Yeah.
Okay, it was very good. It was pretty good for sex for boys or girls, but it wasn't so great for determining whether the embryo was healthy or whether implanted. It turned out it didn't work well at all. But the
Yeah.
techniques we have today are much, much better.
Well, it's interesting because about I don't know what it was. I think a while ago you sent me a study, and then I also, a patient sent me this study about this kind of newer technique for sperm sorting, and it was really interesting. I mean, when I got done reading it, I know you read it because you're the one who sent it to me as well. There was kind of an interesting technique they had on it, which was instead of using um, a sperm sorting technique through cytometry and stuff like that, they were using just a gradient of solution with different gradients, like 90, I think it was like 90, 80, 40, 20 or something like that. And in that study they also found that they had about could get 80% correct with males, 80% correct with females. But what was interesting in that study is that they went and they actually went and did PGT to verify the results. So instead of just leaving it to random chance, injecting it into the uterus, and now you have sperm competing against each other, you have different environments and sperm that might run faster. In this one, they were able to get the 80%, and so it's interesting that when they proved it with the PGT, it really got me kind of thinking, wow, is this really going to work? And so, as I was telling you, and I know you learned today that we actually got IRB approval to do this study, and we're going to be doing that here soon. What do you think of that novel technique? I mean, it's one of the things when I think of sperm sorting is that the difference in the weight of a X and a Y is very small. I mean, Y's are very small compared to an X chromosome, but still, when we're talking about Daltons, it's not tremendous numbers here. And so, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this new technique.
Well, it's interesting because it's not the actual technique itself. I mean, the details, yes, are new, but the idea, the concept behind it, actually predates the sperm sorting, like the microsort, like we were talking about before. There was a technique called the Erickson technique, which used to be done where they used an albumin and they've used gradients, so they've used it. The difference is that now we have good PGT, so we can test them and we can use the sperm to enrich the sample, right? So we have a better chance of having more boys or more girls, assuming, of course, that our study proves what the other study did. But assuming it does, we have a chance to enrich it, but it's not enough to sort it. There's still a very high risk you're not going to get the results you want.
Yeah, I mean, one out
You
of five.
stack the odds, sort of.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting where I think why I was interested in doing this study and kind of replicating to find out if it is correct is, and I'm sure you've had this before, where someone comes in and they want, let's say, a female or they want a male, and they go through IVF, and unfortunately, all the males come back abnormal, and there's only females, and they're devastated. They wanted males, and in my mind, I'm like, God, I wish I could increase the amount of males in there so that way they have a higher chance. And so one of the thoughts I had was, if we can replicate this, that's really, I mean, when you think about peer review this, when you can replicate a study, it validates it. If we can replicate this and still get 80%, I mean, that's tremendous, because now if someone's going through for gender selection or family balancing, they could have 80% of the gender they want, and then increases their chances of coming away. Whereas right now, as you know, and I know, that someone goes through and it's kind of the luck of the draw. If you don't get the gender you want, you're kind of have to do it all over again. And so that's what's exciting to me. And I like I said, I'm really hoping this really does pan out. What are your thoughts on that?
I had a case a long time ago where I had a patient who was doing IVF just for gender selection, and we had 17 embryos that we biopsied, and every one of them was the sex they didn't want. Now,
Yeah.
something like that doesn't happen very often, but it kind
Yeah.
of sticks in your mind. But it does, best, it's going to, on average, it's going to be about 50-50, and
Yeah.
sometimes the other way around. If we can stack the odds even a little bit without doing something that's dangerous, that was the big thing. The microsort technique there was concerns about it, right?
Yeah.
We were putting fluorescent tags on the sperm. We were exposing them to intravenous light. We were sending them through a flow cytometer, and those things could potentially damage it. So if we're damaging it, we don't know if we're giving you something that you're going to pass on to your kids.
Yeah.
Where
Absolutely.
the baby's going to pass on to the kids. We have no idea. With this, there's really no risk. It's not really doing anything that much more invasive than we're already doing every time we do IVF or even IUI.
Yeah, and so for patients to understand that, what Dr. was saying is that when we get the sperm ready for IVF, we put it on a gradient and then we put it through a centrifuge and we separate it. And so basically, it's removing a lot of the bad sperm that is not motile or that has abnormal shapes. So we get a better concentration of better sperm. So this technique is basically using that. That technique is tried and true. I mean, for years and years, we know that children have been fine following that preparation of sperm. So it makes it a little bit of a safer technique. We still had to go through the International Review Board to get permission to do this study because, again, we are using human tissues. We were making babies here, so it was very important that we made sure we did this correctly. And like I said, in the next month here, we'll start allowing patients to come into the study. I wonder. I don't know. Like, part of me wants to believe it will work, but part of me, I don't know. I'm always curious about studies when they come out and these type of things. And so, I don't know. You think it's gonna come out? You think we'll show 80/80 like it says it does?
I think so. I don't know if it'll show 80, but I think it'll certainly be an improvement over what it is right now, over doing nothing. And, even if it's a slight improvement, it's not very dangerous. It's not very difficult to do. So, it makes a lot of sense even for a slight improvement.
Yeah, it was interesting how they did the study because what they did first is to verify it. They used fish technology to basically fluorescent, which sperms were X's and Y's. So that's how they were able to get the distribution to figure out the 80/80. And then what they did is they verified it when they used ICSI then to do PGTA. I wonder, I mean, theoretically, when you think about it, if truly you can get 80% of sperm one gender and you do an IUI, you would think it would still give you an 80% chance of having that gender. But you and I were talking about this beforehand that, there is some question about sperm that are males swim faster. And so will that be lost? In other words, if we get 80% female, are we still going to see an 80% female rate using IUI, putting that sperm in, because of that male sperm might have a little bit of advantage over it? It'll be interesting. I like I said, in the future to figure out if that ends up being.
I doubt it, to be honest with you, because the techniques that were used in the past aren't terrible, and they were used for IUI mostly. And when they were used for IVF, like I said, the PGT wasn't very good anyway. So it didn't work in the past with that.
No.
But now that we're using to enrich when we're doing the IVF, I think I think for IVF, yes, but I think for IUI, it's not going to be consequential enough to make any difference. I wish it was. It would be great for people, but
I mean, like I said, if this is going to be a game changer in my mind, because to me, if you can come to our clinic and you can at least guarantee that 80% of the embryos are going to be the gender you want and you're trying to do family balancing, it's a game changer. I mean, because it's just devastating. Most people don't. You mentioned 17 embryos, but most people don't get that many embryos. I mean, it's usually people get somewhere between, maybe 4 and 8, if they're younger. If they're older, it could be between 1 and 4. And it's, you can flip a quarter 4 times in a row and get 4 heads. So it really is going to be a game changer if this comes through. And I'm really excited to be able to offer it to people once it's there. We do have a guest here. I want to kind of go to her. I think, we'll kind of stay on this topic for a little bit, and we'll always jump to moving on to the Zymot a little bit later. But Marcel is here, and we can kind of talk to her here a second. Marcel, I'm going to bring you up on the stage. And then how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. I know you're probably a few degrees cooler there in Tucson, right?
Well, it is really hot right now. Either way.
Just not as bad as Phoenix.
Exactly. Well, tonight, you don't have to ask a question based off of this specific topic, but we're talking about like basically way to search a sort sperm to be able to get things like genders. What questions do you have for us tonight, Marcella?
Well, about the gender, for me, it's really interesting that people do want that, that they look for a gender. I have friends that have done that, like for IVF, like they have four boys and they want like another girl and they try it and it doesn't work out. So if that gives them like a really high percentage of having whatever they want, it's okay. For me, that I struggle with this, whatever I have, it's fine.
For most people, that's probably true, but we do have people specifically who want that.
Yeah.
Yes, I think people that don't have a problem having a baby, they do want that. Whenever you do have a problem, it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah.
But it's really interesting because most people would want that whenever they don't have a problem to conceive, to get the gender they want.
Yeah, it's. I don't know if you saw the episode we did about 2 weeks ago, where it was up on a family balancing, and at that time, one of the things we talked about were there are lots of reasons to do family balancing.
Hmm.
Sometimes some people have lots of kids. Sometimes there's medical diseases that can be passed along. There might even be higher risk in certain sexes that where diseases can be passed along. But the other thing that came up, and it's a really important point, and matter of fact, I came across it again today, is that when people have losses, sometimes it's hard to walk away from that sex of your child. And like today, I had a patient who had twins, and she wasn't wanting twins. She actually put back one embryo. She only wanted a singleton, but the embryo split. And now she wants to put back two because she wants to get back to that point because she feel like she lost those. And that's another area where I see a lot of people sometimes want that, or if they lose a child, if they had a couple children, they lost one, there was a daughter, they want another girl. And so you're right. Most people who are infertile, they'll be happy with anything, just like I was.
Hmm.
Most people but sometimes unfortunately there are some situations where family balancing and picking but I know we say gender selection. I mean, technically we should really say sex selection at this point because now we call it sex, but the point same is you're picking the sex of the baby, and you make a valid point.
Yes, yeah. So the embryo, I didn't know that whenever you put one embryo, it can split. So whenever I get my embryo, it can split, and then I can have twins.
It's
It's
about
about 1 in
1%. It's
40
not
chance.
super high.
Yeah, it's very low, so it's a
But it
little.
can happen.
It can.
Oh my God, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I didn't know that. So I learned something else today.
That's actually one of the reasons why we recommend putting back one embryo, because when you put back two embryos, especially when you do PGT testing, the chances are so high that both can implant. We're talking above 50%. And then now if you have a 1% chance that one can split and both of them can split, now you have a high risk of triplets. And that's where we see triplets a lot of times, is when you put back two embryos that are tested. And so that's where that whole thing comes of putting back one embryo at a time.
Oh, okay.
It
So
does
I
happen.
got
I actually had a patient with two sets of identical twins at the same time.
Oh my God.
I was on World News Tonight with her. That's how rare this is.
That's extremely rare.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very rare. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I learned a lot today with you guys. I really enjoy your podcast every week. And
Well,
the Taco Tuesday fertility, or that name, you know what I mean. Your
talk
podcast.
about Fertility
I listen
Tuesday.
to it
Yeah.
too.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming on tonight.
Thanks.
I'll see you soon next week.
See you soon. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
One person had a question here where they said, when embryos are stored, are they separated by gender? Does the clinic know gender of embryos, or only able to learn the gender with PGD testing? And so, if you want to answer that question, Dr. Derman, I think it sounds like there's two questions there. First question they're asking is, can we know the gender, without PGD testing, obviously, which is no. But the thing is, we pretty much separate all the embryos, so they're always independent. But if you wanted to answer that question for them, so when embryos are stored, are they separated by gender, And does the clinic know the gender of embryos, or only able to learn the gender with PGT testing?
Well, first of all, as you said, there is no way to know the sex of the baby. I was having this discussion with a patient, I guess yesterday, and said there's nothing, you can't tell whether a baby, the sex of a baby until about 11 weeks. They look pretty much the same. And with an embryo, there's absolutely no difference. Now, we know sometimes male embryos grow a little bit faster, but you can't reach any assumptions about that.
Yeah.
We separate in our center. I believe we separate everyone one at a time because we do single embryo transfers. Some clinics may put two in at a time. I'm not sure, but we don't do that. So we have every embryo that we've frozen is cataloged. We know when the PGS was done. We know the sex. We know which one it is. We know the stage it's at. So we have all that information on each one. And so we thaw a specific container that has that one. But you cannot tell the sex of a baby without PGT. There's no way.
Yeah. Years ago, we used to actually put multiple embryos into one straw. So each embryo has its own straw now. And that's because single embryo transfers are very common now. Back in the past, people would put back 2-3 embryos in the past because the rates weren't as good. But now that's not as common. So the part of that question is, yes, we do individually put the embryos in the straws. They are separated. But especially when you do any type of testing, because then you have to go back, and when you get the answer of it's a female or a male, then you can go back and say, yep, that's the female, that one's the male, and so forth. So one of the questions that comes up is, are you able to not select a gender and have your doctor surprise you with the embryo? So I'll start with this analysis. So it's a great question. Yeah, you don't have to pick the sex of the baby, and you don't have to even know it. Matter of fact, I would even tell you, if you don't want to know the sex of the baby and you are doing PGTA, let them know that, because then what we can do is we can actually put on the order and to the company, so they won't even send the information about the sex. We will never know the sex of the baby. You won't know the sex of the baby. It's a complete surprise. The concerning thing is, if you don't want to know it, but we still get the results, it is possible it could actually be told you, because it's very difficult to have everyone, not telling the results, and it's already in the report. So essentially, when you go through PGT-A, which is when you're looking for aneuploidy, making sure the embryos are abnormal or normal, it already comes with the sex of the baby because it's in the DNA. But if you chose to not have that, you could just say, pick the best embryo, we'll put the best embryo back. And if you chose not to have the information on the report, then we wouldn't even know, and we just pick the best embryo as well. But yes, you can always be surprised. And that's I've had many of those deliveries. I'm sure you have too, Dr. Derman. You bring the baby on, you're like, hey, it's a boy or it's a girl. And it's a pretty exciting time at those times.
A lot of times people tell us they want that. And then after we put the embryo back in, they want to know what was it, after they decided not to even find out.
There is a little bit benefit knowing early, though, because you can start planning, you start buying the clothes, you can get everything versus everything becoming very generically given to you. So here is a question here. I'm going to see if I can copy it and then put it above here. But the question here is, does having sperm spun before an IUI increase any chances of getting a current gender? So I'm going to let you hit that one, since I did the last one.
Sure. Well, the idea of the sperm sorting techniques, like was done before, and like what we're looking at right now, is to actually see if that does that. As far as we know, there really isn't a difference in the live birth rates, with boys and with girls. I think the conception rates are a little bit higher with males. The live birth rates are a little bit better with females. So it winds up evening itself out. So IUI should not really affect it.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, exactly. I mean, it really shouldn't. I've never seen anything where higher chances. There was, do you remember when, and I think I was talking to Dr. Salem about this last time. Do you remember there was, when we used to do fresh transfers, there was this question of whether the male embryos would make it the blastulation a little bit faster.
Yeah, they
And
do
so
grow. They're about half a day ahead on average.
yeah. And so that was the concern. And that when we went to frozen transfers, we stopped a lot of that pushing more male embryos, in that situation.
But I don't think we actually had the higher rates of males when we did that, though.
I mean, I don't know
I'm
if there
not
was
aware
any.
of it.
Yeah,
I'm not aware
I
of
just
the
know people
space
talked
ratio
about it.
being different now that we do frozen embryo transfers as
Yeah,
compared to fresh.
exactly. It's funny because when you think about it, I mean, people have for centuries been trying to, as I talked about this in the last show, I mean, they've been trying to pick sex through, different ways through intercourse and stuff like that. And now we finally have a method, and soon we might have a better method. I don't know if we're ever going to get 100% where we can figure it out without doing IVF. I just don't know if it's ever going to get to that point. It's just too difficult when you're talking about sperm, but maybe someday. Separate question before we get on to this next one. We'll answer this, and then I think then we should go on to the microfluids that we were talking about earlier. But the question was just, what are the odds with 2 embryos transfer that were untested? And just a general, I think, question about what are the chances when putting back embryos. I don't know if you want to answer this one, and we'll kind of talk about both that and for euploid embryos as well.
Well, a lot of it depends, of course, on how old you are. So if you have somebody who's young or somebody is older and has done PGS, if we put in 2 embryos, we generally tell patients the pregnancy rates go from around 62% to high 60s. So you improve your chances a little bit. But we also encourage people, I assume that's what you're asking about, is the pregnancy rate. If I'm wrong and you want to know about the sex ratios, that's a different story. But I can answer that for you too. But let's say that's the case. So we go from 62 to high 60s, which is great. We improve the pregnancy rate, but you increase the risk of complications. Twins have 5 times the risk of complications of single pregnancy, to you, to the baby, and there's more problems with that. The other thing is your cumulative chances of having a baby. If we put in one at 62%, and if it doesn't work or you miscarry, putting in another one at 62%, your cumulative chance of having a baby is actually higher doing one at a time with less complications. So we really, really strongly encourage it that people put back just one. There's just not.
Yeah.
It sounds great. It sounds like you're getting 2 for 1, but you're going to have more. There's more likely going to be problems with the babies, I should say.
Yeah.
It's not just buying more diapers.
And you were saying the statistics is technically, if you wanted one gender, theoretically, if you put back 2 and you said, I want at least a chance of having a boy, then you would increase your chances then to a 75% chance, at least that it's one of them will become a boy if you have that. So
Yeah.
the 50-50.
Yeah, you will increase the chances of that with 2, but probably
you
not.
bring up a good point. I mean, I myself being a father of 2 sets of twins. When I did IVF, I mean, in my mind, I was like, we're definitely putting back 2, but things have changed a lot. I think part of that mindset that's changed is when I went through and we put back 2 embryos back in, that was the early, 2000s, the chances were lower then with 2 embryos than it is even with 1 blastocyst now. Not even tested. Just 1 blastocyst now has a better pregnancy chance than 2 embryos were on day 3 back in the past. And so, there's this really push to go to single embryo transfers because there is less risk. And one thing I was talking to Dr. Derman about today is that it's even to the point now where it's not even going to be up to clinics anymore. Pretty soon, the insurances are putting enough pressure now that we're not even going to have choices anymore. The days of putting back 2 are going to be gone here pretty soon, other than, boutique clinics are only just doing cash paying only. So anyways.
When I started in practice, we used to put back 4 embryos.
That's still insane.
The pregnancy rates were terrible. Good clinic had like a 30% pregnancy rate, which is half of what we have. And we put back 4 embryos. We used to get triplets all the time, but you had to do that to get a decent chance for it working.
that's one of the ways you could actually kind of tell us if a clinic was good or not, right? I mean, clinics, you have to look at the pregnancy rates, and then you had to also look and go, wait, how many are they putting back on average? If they're putting back 3 on average, they get the same pregnancy rate as the one who's putting back 1 on average. It tells you that their rates aren't as good. Well, before we go on to this next question from one of the patients, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the Zymot chip. And the Zymot chip is a chip that uses basic kinetics of the sperm going through a channel. Think of it like an obstacle course. And then over a period of time, they remove then the sperm from the end of the channel. And that sperm has, without question, this part is definitely proven, it has a lower DNA fragmentation. So this part has been proven. But the question that came up is then, but does it make a difference clinically? In other words, does it make more euploid embryos? Does it make a higher fertilization rate? Does it have healthier pregnancies or more live births? And so this month, there was actually a paper that came out, and both Dr. Derman and myself read this paper that talked about this. And it was kind of an interesting one because it was a double-blinded, very well done study. And it came out with some results that I thought were a little surprising because I think they came to conclusions that were a little, there was trends, as you and I talked about, that they didn't say there was more euploid embryos, but I feel like if there was a big enough power, there would be. But in the end, I mean, what they did was they compared using the standard technique of spinning sperm, which the thought is that it increases some fragmentation of the sperm when you spin it, versus the other one where you don't spin it and you don't get the fragmentation. And what they did find, at least in the study, was they truly found that the fertilization was significantly better. And so I think, this study was kind of all comers in some ways. But I'd love to hear your view, Dr. Derman. I know the view of Zymot and the studies they've done, and I've seen all the little small studies that have shown like the decrease in fragmentation. That's not a question. But it's placed like in medicine, like who would you recommend it for to a patient if they said, hey, should I use Zymot? I tend to tell people, older men, so people who have higher sperm DNA fragmentation, people who have had some issues with fertilization, I think it's beneficial for. I would never really use it for someone who, let's say, had fewer euploid embryos. I would say, well, it's such a small amount, it may benefit that. I don't know if I would ever use it for that purpose. So it's not too surprising when they put that in study. But I'd love to hear your view on this because it is something that's, somewhat newer. It hasn't been around that long.
Well, I think a big part of the reason that we didn't see more euploid embryos, now I assume that everyone understands euploid or embryos that have the right number of chromosomes, right? Whether it's a boy or a girl, at the correct number. When they're aneuploid, those are the ones that we can't use because they're not going to give us healthy babies. Anyway, so we saw in the study, they saw that the fertilization rates were better, but they didn't see that the percent of the embryos that were genetically normal were higher. And my take on it isn't that the Zymot wasn't working. It's that the sperm problems only account for a very small portion of what's going on. So you need to do a lot more people to see that, right? Maybe 10% of IVF failures are due to sperm issue, or due to sperm issues. With ICSI, we can overcome almost all of them.
Yeah.
I've had patients who, in the past, who didn't do well. There were other procedures that we did to help when there was high sperm fragmentation, and those help, I think, in select people. So certainly when there's bad sperm problems, when guys are older, things like that, I think it definitely helps. Otherwise, I don't know. Maybe it does. If it does, it's so subtle that you don't even notice the difference.
Yeah, and like you and I said, I mean, I just don't see even a reason why it would, just because most of the genetic problems come from the egg anyways, not as much from the sperm, unless you have men who are much older, and then we do see some as bad fertilization and poor embryo quality. It was interesting. One of the things they said is they said they had similar between both groups of a high quality blastulation rates and blasts. It would be kind of interesting, now with the AI being used. I wonder if AI would say the blasts are just as good as each other, and obviously in this clinically, they found the pregnancy rates, there was no significant difference. They did say that the clinical loss rate was higher in the sperm group that didn't use the Zymot chip. So there was a trend towards the significance there. So there is a question of whether even it does reduce miscarriages. And so, again, another sperm storing technique. It's funny, when I spoke to the guy who invented this, I asked him, I said, "Hey, are you working on one to do gender selection?" And he said that's something he would love to be able to do. I don't know if he's be able to do that yet, but that's something that he was, trying to get to at some point. So it'd be kind of neat eventually if they can come up with something like that. Anything else you had to add to the Zymot debate, or I mean, again, I tell people all the time, like it's one of those things where it probably doesn't help everyone, but it does probably benefit some. And like at our clinic, we kind of use it across the board. We just feel like, it has a lot of benefit. Again, now this is proven: better fertilization, less DNA fragmentation, and now here even lower clinical loss rates. But again, I mean, if I knew who to use it for, that would be a better way to use it. It's just right now we don't, and so we just say, okay, we'll use it for everyone. But
Well, the other thing is we do get better fertilization rates with it, right?
Yeah.
So if we
Correct.
get better fertilization rates, even if the percentage of the embryos that are healthy is the same, the same percentage on a higher number of embryos is still better.
Yeah.
Right? You still have a
I
better
agree
chance of
100%.
baby, right?
Yeah.
A better chance that you'll have leftovers for the next one. So
Yeah.
even if it's one or two, that can make a difference in a lot of patients.
Yeah, a lot of other doctors, other clinics ask me all the time. They're like, "Do you really think it helps?" I said, "We see a benefit, we do, but it's small. It's not a big benefit." And that's what the study showed. I mean, it wasn't like the fertilization of one was 50 and the next one was 80. It was 69.9% versus 76. But it doesn't sound like a lot. But that's a over a 6% increase. That's almost like an 8% increase there. So I mean, that's a big amount. One of the questions got asked here was, with the Zymot chip, will that help find sperm that is not affected by high DNA fragmentation? And I think we kind of answered that a little bit right there, which was, yeah, absolutely. That's really what it does. It lowers the fragmentation down to almost zero. It's not zero, but almost zero. There has been some question about if swim ups may do better against the Zymot chip, because with swim ups, you're not using the centrifuge, so you're not getting the damage to the sperm. And so there might be, when you compare it there, you may not see as much of a difference in the sperm DNA fragmentation. But great question, Amanda. Something we were definitely going to talk about tonight. Before we go into the next question, anything else you have to add to the Zymot debate, or any?
No, I think it's a very good thing. It's not something that necessarily helps everybody, but it's one of those things there's infertility. I like to describe as like a death of 1,000 cuts. And if we can prevent one of those cuts, we want to do whatever we can, because those things all add up, all those little things.
They do. And I think the most important thing is it's not harmful. I think that's the important thing for someone to understand. So if you're at a clinic where, they offer it and maybe it's an add-on cost, it's not going to hurt anything. No one's ever going to be harmed by it right now. I think one thing that is important to know is not everyone can use it. You do need a certain amount of sperm to be able to use it. And you also, at this current time, need to do ICSI, where you have to inject the sperm into the egg. It is not useful to do with standard insemination. There are some protocols out there, but there were some questions about how well it worked, and most places will do it with ICSI only. Well, jumping on one of the next questions here, we'll kind of jump to one, is, can you comment on day 7 embryos and success? We got 2 day 7s, a 6BB, a 5BC from our 8 donor eggs. Both ended up euploid. And so I'm assuming they say comment, like success. If you want, I'll leave that up. If you want to jump on that first, Dr. Derman, and what your thoughts are, and I can give some of the data that we're seeing.
We were just having a conversation about
we did this morning.
We were talking about how, with the day 7 embryos are definitely less effective. We do get pregnancies from them, but the pregnancy rates are lower. Day 5 and 6 are fairly comparable, but once you get to day 7, it's less likely. But the fact that they're euploid is good.
Yeah. So, I find it what I find really interesting about day 7 embryos, and the thing that we had the conversation about this morning was I had a couple who actually had donor embryos too. They were at a place that they had a guarantee, and their guarantee was they would get a euploid embryo, but the euploid embryos were day 7. And so the question was, is that really as good as getting one day 5 euploid embryo? And so what the data shows for sure is there is definitely a lower pregnancy rate. It could be somewhere between about 30 and 40%, depending on the grade. So I'll tell you, someone who has day 7, 6BB and BC, depends what clinic you're at. If you're at our clinic, those are pretty good embryos. If it's a BC and it's using a Gardner system ABC, then that is a little bit lower, and that one will probably have a little bit of a lower chance. When we look back at our data, if we didn't test them and we just took day 7 CC embryos on our grading, that would be equivalent to like a BB embryo using the Gardner system. There were almost no pregnancies at all if they weren't euploid. So meaning like if we didn't test them and just put them back, that's how low. That was out of something like 20 something day 7s. So at that point, we stopped transferring day 7 embryos that were not tested if they were CC because the chances are just so low. Once you test them, then you start seeing the rate go up. But the problem that is with day 7 embryos is there's already something a little bit wrong. Day 6 embryos are that could be a little bit, if you're biopsying, maybe you just have to wait a little bit longer. You're just letting it get a little bigger before you freeze it. But day 7, I mean, you're talking about an embryo that took longer to get to the same point. And just like if it took a kid longer to develop, you would start questioning, going, hey, what's wrong? And so the problem is when we say something's euploid, we have to remember that we're only looking at it from the large scale, looking way up. Well, no, everything looks normal. It's not until you get down to the very low level that you go, oh wow, there are some DNA issues in there, and that's probably why day 7s don't work as well. But the thing is, it's not so low, like 10% or 5%, that we can't freeze them. So that's why we tend to freeze day 7s, because it does at least have a decent chance. And for that reason, most places will start doing day 7s, especially if you're doing biopsy. Now, I would say 2 day 7s, I mean, you're talking, even if it's 40% chance, that's about at least a 60+% chance of coming away successful after doing transferring both those in consecutively.
The other thing to keep in mind is also our laboratory folks are very strict graders. Okay, so a 5 or 6 cc in our hands still gives us a very good pregnancy rates. I've worked with labs in the past where we would get AAs all the time, which we'd almost never get. And
Yep.
the pregnancy rates were lower with AAs in some places than RCCs, which are the worst ones that will freeze. So it does depend.
Yeah.
On
And
the
so
lab.
in this situation, the person did write back and say that it was true from our in-house donor. And so for that reason, I would say, I'd say about at least a 60+% chance of coming away successful, especially that BB embryo. That's a very good embryo. And even the BC one is with our grading. So, you can feel pretty good. And like I said, would everyone love to have A embryos day 5, perfect? But you don't need that. You don't need perfect to get pregnant. That's the important part. There are many. We should even make a Facebook group called the CC group, and I'm sure you will have lots and lots of people who have CC babies there, and they're the smartest, best babies in the world, and they do very well. So nothing to be worried about, and I'll pray and hope that everything goes well for you. With Another question came back up again. I'm going to let you jump on this one. It was, with high DNA fragmentation, would it, I think they said, cause a growing embryo to stop growing due to fragmentation in the embryo? Is that related at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would. That's the whole point of the DNA fragmentation, right? So the sperm contains the DNA, it's packed in there tightly, and it has to decompress. When the DNA is fragmented, the process of meiosis, where the egg and the sperm are the DNA is merging together and everything, gets disrupted when the sperm isn't packed and unpacked properly. And that's the problem with the DNA fragmentation. So you're going to get bad DNA, and that's, even if it corrects itself, it's likely to cause more problems. Now, if it goes through that, and the embryo is healthy and the genetic testing is fine, it's probably okay. It probably survived that. But if not, yeah, definitely, that's what we're concerned about, and that's the only reason that we test it.
Yeah. And it's important too to keep in mind that it really does matter also where the egg is from. So, if sperm has high DNA fragmentation, let's say, we'll just use an example. Let's say your partner is 55 years old who is providing the sperm, but the egg is from a 25-year-old, which again, that's very weird. I get that. It's going to do much, much better than someone who is 40 years old. And not just because of the age of the egg, it's because the ability of the egg when they're younger to fix some of the sperm fragmentation can be fixed there. So it really does have a effect. The chip helps. Now in this study, there was a difference between the blastulation rates in the groups, but it was very small, so it was insignificant. So going back to that question then is, will high DNA fragmentation cause a growing embryo to stop growing? The answer is yes. The question is, does a Zymot make a difference? In this study, it did not. It did not change how many made it to the blastocyst, how many stopped growing. Now, the one thing is, and I wasn't sure they were asking this, they said due to fragmentation in the embryo. Now, fragmentation in the embryo is just stress in the embryo. So it's a little bit different than sperm DNA fragmentation. So fragmentation is that the embryo is being stressed. It's basically small little pieces are coming off and it creates this fragmentation inside the embryo. And that's just an example of stress, but those things aren't completely directly related. So I just make sure that that's understood. Well, we have about a little less than 15 minutes left. If anyone else wants to come on here, definitely, come on. Someone that I know really well has a question here. This will be a fun one because this guy, he loves to think about things. So he says, what are your thoughts about the potential in the future for AI-enabled sperm selection and immobilization system, that is AI image analysis that targets the best sperm in view and fires a laser to immobilize it, as conceivable as demonstrated with the SID 2.0? This is a great question. So Steve is an amazing person. So I always love his questions. He always comes up with good ones on this. Steve, this is absolutely, I even mentioned earlier, I said, I wondered if they used AI, would they change their thought on the blastocyst? I don't know how well we're going to be able, how far AI is going to be able to go. Is it going to be able to eventually tell which embryos are euploid? Is it going to be able to tell which embryos are male or female? I don't know, but what I can tell you is that it is not just here for a little bit. It is going to be here for a while. I mean, there's no question that AI will take over a lot of our industry, which is a good thing. I mean, it's only going to make us better because it's able to look at a lot more parameters at one time in a faster speed than we can. And, it will be a tool that we'll use. But love to hear your view too, Dr. Derman, on AI. I'm excited. I'm a nerd, and I think you and I are both nerds. We love this type of stuff. So love to hear your view.
Yeah, I think AI is going to make a big difference. I think we're going to be able to look for things that we just wouldn't look for otherwise, that we wouldn't even realize, right? It could be that AI could wind up finding, like, for example, with the Zymot, that there's things that in the study they're not really looking for because they didn't know to look for it. And without this deep machine learning, it may not occur to people to do that. Now, for targeting the best sperm, I don't know. There probably is. But remember, when we're looking at it, and even what AI will be looking at, is we're looking at the appearance. Okay? We're looking at the shape of the sperm. And the shape of the sperm is great at determining how well it's able to deliver the DNA into the target, into the egg. But to determine whether the DNA that's packaged inside is good or not may be a different story.
Yeah. I wonder, if it could almost be with both the fluid dynamics. Because, I mean, again, the fluid dynamics, when it's going through the Zymot, that's part of what separates it. I think eventually, it might not just be just AI. It might be many things, right? So there are also there are some studies showing that like using higher powered magnification of the sperm can lead to better selection because you can see the acrosomes and things better. We know things like pixie dishes and Zymot chips help with fertilization. So it's there's no question it's going to be there, but you're right. I don't know if it's going to be as simple as just a picture and can figure it out. I think that they're going to have to work together. And like I said, Rooks always has some of the best questions. So it's
I hope
we're
it will.
say again.
I hope it will. I think that would be huge, but whether it will or not, who knows?
So I'm not sure if you're aware of this. I know we're kind of talking about this live, but we are actually going to be adding AI to our clinic. So with our IVC that we do, which is where we do a fresh transfer, one of the problems we run into is our IVC, you just get one transfer. And then basically the rest of the embryos are discarded. So the question is, someone gets 4 embryos, which 2 do you put back? Which one do you put back in the study we're doing? So we're going to start using an AI to help pick the best embryo to increase the pregnancy rate. And so again, I see AI being used in the same way with sperm. There's no question that, you get like newer embryologists and stuff, or experienced ones. There's definitely a difference between them picking sperm and how well they fertilize. And so, and then obviously there's technique involved. Well, so yeah, no question about it. Steve wrote back here with, my thoughts would be fluid dynamics to narrow the field and then final selection. Exactly. That's exactly what I think would happen, is that you would narrow it down and then allowing the AI to then pick the best in that situation. I think we have time for another question or so here, and then we'll probably be, head out. If anyone wants to come on live, again, we'd love to talk to you. So this, we kind of answered this a little bit earlier, but I think it's good we touch on it again. I said, would you do Zymot testing even if your partner's sperm count is normal? No issues. Would this add any additional success for IVF, or is this just only for those who have a lower sperm count? So I'm going to let you start on this one, since I talked a bunch this last time, Dr. Derman.
Well, one of the issues is that we're not sure if the Zymot really helps much when we're not doing ICSI. And our decision to do ICSI is based on what the sperm looks like. So generally, we'll do it a lot, fairly generously, but it may not really help much.
Yeah. And I think one of the questions here is the question of sperm count being normal. This is something when I talk to patients about, I tell them, when you do a semen analysis, we say the sperm is normal. But what does that mean, normal, right? That is just taking a bell-shaped curve of all the sperm counts of, let's say, all the men, and say, okay, well, we know when it has these certain parameters, these people are not going to have problems with infertility. It doesn't mean that everything looks good, that you can't have problems with infertility. So it's just parameters. So when we say normal, that doesn't really mean the sperm is normal. There are some guys out there who have great looking sperm on semen analysis and have a hard time getting pregnant. And there are people who have horrible semen analysis and they have no problem getting pregnant. Matter of fact, if we went and just randomly started checking everybody, we would probably find out there's a lot of variability in the quality of sperm. So people who have many kids. But what we're talking about here is DNA fragmentation and qualities in the sperm that can't be seen just by looking at it under a microscope. And so what I would say about this when they say is the sperm count is normal is, if a sperm count is normal, and again, there's no concern about fertilization, if you're talking about like natural fertilization, it may not have any benefit to Zymot chip. But if someone's older, or you've had a history of poor fertilization, or just in general, if there's concern about of the sperm because of exposures or things like, maybe for him, then that's where you end up using the Zymot chip. And if you're really concerned, you can do what's called a sperm DNA analysis, so fragmentation analysis. And so it's just like a semen analysis. You give the sperm, they evaluate it, they figure out what the oxidative stresses of that, what the DNA fragmentation is, and that will really help you, because if you have a very high DNA fragmentation rate, then you really do want to be using this or some type of method of selecting sperm versus just using standard centrifuging. So, and it would help your IVF success, as your question was asking. But
in that circumstance,
yeah, it's not just for people who have lower sperm counts. So, matter of fact, people who have very severe lower sperm count can't even use it. So, well, I don't see any other questions right now. I'm just gonna, I think was gonna say one more thing about this stuff, but anything else you want to add about the sperm selection or Zymot?
Well, I think the important thing is that both of these things are things that aren't entirely clear. that in certain circumstances, the Zymot is definitely helpful. It might be helpful in other situations, but certainly there are certain situations where it can make a huge difference. And overall, it's a good thing, and there's no risk. When it
Yeah.
comes to the sperm selection for gender, we're not quite there yet, but there's hope. I don't think IUI is likely to. This is likely to help with IUI. I think it's going to be to enrich things for doing IVF and doing PGD or PGS rather, so we get more of the gender, more of the sex that you want. And
Yeah.
that's about the best we can hope for. But if you have 3 or 4 instead of 1 or 2, then the sex you want, that's a good thing, and that's going to
Yeah.
improve the chance that you're going to have the result that you're hoping for.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. I think even with AI, like again, nothing is going to be 100%. And I think one thing that I always like to go back to is that in regular science, there's not as many variables, and the human body, things are just so different. So as you said, in Zymot, it can show benefit in one group, and another group it'll show no benefit, and that's just not just because it doesn't work. It's just that that group didn't benefit because they didn't need it, or maybe there's something different about their body. That woman's younger, so her body was able to fix some of the sperm DNA fragmentation. One area I like to use growth hormone is actually when I know men are older, or if I'm concerned about sperm issues. We know that so it's growth hormone can help those eggs act younger and help with some of those repair mechanisms. So, yeah, I agree completely. I'm hoping this study does show that there's some benefit here, because that would really be a game changer for those who want to have family balancing. Before we could go on, there was one last question I'm just going to throw on there, which was, can you use Zymot if your partner has retrograde ejaculation? And the answer is absolutely. So the only thing retrograde means is just goes into the bladder. So what happens is they give the urine, and then we extract the sperm from that, and it can be used as well.
Provided that we have enough sperm, of course.
If you have enough sperm, that's
Some
the only
cases
thing.
of retrograde ejaculation, we get very little, but if we get a reasonable amount, then we absolutely.
Exactly. Yep. Same thing like anyone, just have to have enough of them. So, well, Dr. Derman, I really appreciate coming on. I know Dr. Salem is probably enjoying his birthday today, and I'm sure his wife was doing a lot of fun stuff for him. So, thank you everyone who who came on, and all the questions, and look forward to talking to you guys again here in about 2 weeks, and we'll post the next topic here in the next week. But thanks so much again, Dr. Derman. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone for joining us.